My name is Emma Vargo. I'm presenting research done with myself, Dr. Kyle Keane, and Professor Craig Carter, all of MIT's Materials Science Department. And my talk is on designing nanostructures that reproduce particular structural colors, specifically using an adaptive mesh search algorithm to do so. Hello everyone, my name is Emma Vargo, and today I'm presenting work I performed with Dr. Kyle Keane, who's present, and Professor Craig Carter. We're all in the Materials Science Department at MIT. And the project we worked on is designing nanostructures that reproduce specific structural colors using an adaptive mesh search technique. And if you're interested in this work, there is a Mathematica package available online at GitHub, and there's also a paper in the Journal of the Optical Society of America. But the problem we're really interested in looking at today is how these beautiful, iridescent, vivid colors arise in nature, not from pigments, from nanostructures. And the problem we're even more interested in is then how do we design ourselves nanostructures like these that replicate the colors that we're specifically interested in. And so the phenomenon that we're interested in is called structural coloration. And it's a physical phenomenon that's separate from most color that we see around us, which is derived from pigments, which are a chemical composition. Structural coloration is the geometry of the material itself contributes to its color. And so photonic structures are composite materials. They're made out of two different materials with different refractive indices. And so as light passes through interfaces between the two materials, light is going to interact with that interface. It's going to bend. And in turn, different amounts of light are going to interfere with each other as they pass through. And so this little gadget here shows us kind of the concept of interference. So here we see that the light waves coming off of the structure are in phase, and so the magnitude is going to add, and we're going to have a very strong amplitude here. But as we increase the frequency and the wavelength gets smaller, the waves stop being in phase and they actually become out of phase. And so as we get towards these green wavelengths, we see that these two waves here are actually going to cancel out when they're added together, leading to a very low amplitude. And so already we get the intuition that this particular structure is going to be purple rather than green, because we see such a strong magnitude of those purple wavelengths. And this really is the principle of structural coloration. Of course, as your structures get more and more complicated, the patterns of interference are going to become more and more complicated, but the general principle is the same. And so if we want a structurally colored material, we have two main requirements. First, the material has to have a periodic refractive index. This generally comes in the form of having two materials that alternate spatially, so that you have the refractive index of one and the refractive index of another in a periodic way. And this periodicity also needs to be approximately the same size as wavelengths of visible light. And so when we see color, we're seeing light that is ranging in wavelength from 350 nanometers to about 700 nanometers. And so these nanostructures are on that order, generally about 100 nanometers to 1,000 nanometers, possibly even 10,000 nanometers. And this is so that the interference phenomenon is occurring in the range that we perceive as color. You can have the same phenomenon infrared and ultraviolet, but we just don't appreciate it when it's happening at those wavelengths. And so we can create synthetic versions of these structural color materials. In order to do that, we kind of need to understand the relationship between color and photonic structure. And this is actually a very complicated function, even on the most basic level, from a number of parameters. First, we care about the optical properties of the materials, so the refractive index, in this case of the red material and the blue material. We need to think about the geometry of the structure. So is it one-dimensional, two-dimensional, three-dimensional? Is it somewhat irregular? The structure feature size, and so even if we have this one-dimensional object, if these blue layers are 100 nanometers versus 1,000 nanometers, there's going to be a very different color produced. And then finally, the viewer's position. So contrary to pigment coloration, structural coloration is actually angle dependent. And we kind of get a sense of this if we look at a peacock feather, for example, and if you tilt it, you see that the color is shimmery and it changes. And this is the angle dependence of structural coloration. And so then we can introduce the inverse problem, which is given a desired color, such as this blue color here, how can I design a photonic structure that reproduces it? And so in order to solve this problem, we need to understand the relationship between structure and color, which you may already have a sense is fairly complicated. So first we can look at modeling structural color, so how we go from the geometry of our photonic material to the color. The simplest possible structural material is a one-dimensional stack where you have alternating layers of two different materials. And so in this case, in order to maintain periodicity, all of the red layers need to be the same thickness, and all of the blue layers need to be the same thickness, though those thicknesses don't necessarily need to be the same. And so two parameters we can play with is thickness of the red, thickness of the blue, in order to get different structural colors. And we can just do that. So in order to mathematically model this one-dimensional photonic crystal here, we can use a modified version of Bloch's theorem. Bloch's theorem is built to deal with periodic media, and we can specify it to mean optically periodic media. And this model accounts for all the parameters mentioned above. So we can change the refractive indices and see that the color changes as a result. We can change the widths or the thicknesses of these layers. We can actually add layers, and that generally increases the amplitude of the signal. And then finally, we can change our angle with respect to the photonic structure itself. And so this graph on the far side of this visualization is very important. It's the reflectance spectrum. So the way that the material is reflecting light as a function of its wavelength. And the way that I'm coloring it right now is saying that the wavelength that is reflected with the greatest amplitude gives the color of this material, but in fact, that's a gross oversimplification. The relationship between a spectrum and its color is actually fairly complicated, and it comes down to the physiology of the human eye. And so if we're looking at modeling spectrum into color, we're thinking about the XYZ color space, which is based on the way that our eyes perceived color. You have three different types of color percepting cells in your eyes, the cones. You have cones that specialize with the longer wavelengths, the red cones. You have cones that specialize in the medium wavelengths, which would be the green cones. And then finally, you have cones that specialize in the shorter wavelengths, or the blue cones. And as we change the relative stimulation of these different cone cells, our brain is going to perceive this as different colors. And so say that we're viewing an object and it's giving off a particular reflectance spectrum into the eye. The way that our brain views color is that it fits these different cone cells, using them as basis functions, to the photonic spectrum itself. And based on how much the different wavelength areas are being stimulated, you're going to have a perceived color. In this case, this blue color here. And so we see now that a spectrum into a color is a terrific compression of information. You're going from a continuous function into three discrete values, and somehow expecting that to hold the same information, which is amazing. So these visualizations here each show two distinct color reflectance spectrum that are perceived by our eyes to be the same color. And so the key takeaway here is that when we're working with color, we can't use its reflectance spectrum as a proxy, even though it's very tempting because it's quantitative, it's a function, we know how to work with it mathematically. When we're working with color, we really need to work with color, and we can't say a spectrum is necessarily the same. And so if we take each combination of parameters, in this case the layer thicknesses of that one-dimensional photonic crystal, and we take the reflectance spectra that those structures generate, and then convert that into a perceived color, we can visualize our parameter space in this way. So we can visualize it as kind of a colored parameter space. And so we see that this is interesting. It's a fairly complicated parameter space, even though the structure itself is very simple. And we also see that very different structures can give nearly identical colors. And so already I get a sense that this is going to be a difficult problem to solve because it's not a simple mapping between a color to a structure. There's going to be lots of options. And so here is the inverse problem. Given a desired color, how can we find a photonic structure that reproduces it? So our challenges are going to be linking a single perceived color to a single reflectance spectrum. It just can't be done. And there's infinite combinations of photonic structure parameters, the thicknesses, the materials, the number of layers, the viewing angle. And so really, there's no way to mathematically work backwards. We can't say, here's our color, here is exactly the structure we need to reproduce it. And so instead of working backwards, we need to very efficiently work forwards, and this introduces the need for an efficient search method. So as you saw before, this parameter space is interesting, and the most interesting and important part about it is that it is smooth, that the neighbors are similar to themselves, and you get information. Say I'm in this region, I have a good sense that I'm going to be a green color because all the neighbors around me are green. And so this is in contrast to a non-smooth parameter space where each of these combinations of parameters would give an independent color. And so I call this differentiability. The parameter space is continuous and smooth, We can think about it in the same way that we think about differentiable functions. And this is great because then we can use all of the wealth of tools that we have to deal with differentiable parameter spaces mathematically, so long as we can think of a way to consider colors in a quantitative way. So if we can quantitate the difference between two colors, give that a number, then we can work with all sorts of search algorithms that have already been developed. And the way that we do this is we work in the theoretical LAB color space. And so LAB color space happens when you take colors that we perceive to be opposites and you use them to create three independent axes. So we have black and white, blue and yellow, red and green. And so every color that we can perceive is going to fit somewhere within this sphere of opposites. And the sphere has a radius of 0.5, and so the maximum distance two objects can be within the sphere is 1. And so we can use Euclidean distance to quantify how different two colors appear to ourselves. Mathematica has a color distance function, and so for example, we can look at white and black. We expect this to have a color distance of 1, which is the maximum, and it does. If we want to look at red's distance between darkening shades of red, we can do that as well. And we see that the distance increases. And in fact, it's a very nice linear increase as we're moving down this axis towards the black side of the parameter, or the LAB color space. And so now we have a way to quantify how different two colors are from each other, which is really the last thing that we need in order to construct a search algorithm. We can also think about CIE delta E star color distance as a dartboard. So say you're trying to get red. If you land really close to the center, you're going to be at a color distance of about 0.05, which to my eye at least is pretty much indistinguishable from red. And as you get further and further away, the colors that will be allowed are going to be more and more differed from red. And as a threshold, in commercial graphics, they say that colors are similar enough to be perceived as identical if the color distance is less than or equal to 0.06. And so I kind of use that as a metrics for judging how good my results are. And so now we can introduce the adaptive mesh search, which is the way that I decided to search through these parameter spaces. And the way I do this is I take the parameter space and I fill it with an evenly spaced mesh of points. I calculate the reflectance spectrum at each of those points. I convert that spectrum into a color. And then I use the color distance function to measure the distance between that color and the color that I'm looking for. In this case, kind of this teal. And so I do that, I calculate the set of color distances, and I choose the set that has the closest color distance. And then I use these particular sets of parameters to generate new meshes with a higher resolution. And then I repeat. I calculate all the color distances, I choose the best set, I create a new mesh, and I continue until I have my set of good enough color matches. And so all of these stars represent parameter combinations that will give a color close enough to the desired color. And so we can look at results for this one-dimensional geometry. Here is a set of randomly generated colors, and here is the match that I find after 10 iterations. And at least to my eye, these are very good color matches. This one at the bottom here is a little dark, but otherwise they're practically indistinguishable. And this is validated by the color distance scores. For the most part, they're well under the 0.06 threshold. And here is a schematic of the convergence at each iteration. So these are the 10 values we start with across the entire parameter space. And as we iterate, we narrow the selection into a few spots with very good color matches. And even after only 3 iterations, we're well under the 0.06 threshold, and we have possible color space parameter mixes that match the color very well. And so I mentioned that there is a package. We can see how that works now. I'm going to import it. Photonic system 1D is the way that I'm representing the parameters that are fixed. So these aren't the ones that I'm varying over. And here I'm going to actually choose a new color just for fun. Let's see. I like that one. And now we're going to try to match it using a one-dimensional photonic crystal. And so this iteration is going to first spit out the dimensions that give the best results. And so I see that if I have layers of 250 nanometers and then 150 nanometers, this is going to be one of the best results in terms of matching this color. I see the colors of each of these suggested dimensions, the color distances, And then finally, a visual representation of the two colors side by side. So here my color distance is 0.078, and I get the sense that I have to iterate again at least a few times to get a very good color match. But already this is fairly good. And the really great thing about this search algorithm is that it's general enough to be applied to any geometry, to any set of parameters. As long as you're narrowing in on those colors you want, you're going to end up getting good results. And so we can apply this to other geometries and other mathematical models. And so the two-dimensional case is the photonic lattice. It looks like this. The simulation is a Fortran code called ANCS. It was written by Ward and Pendry, and it gives solutions using FDTD techniques. And here are my results. Here's my parameter space for the two-dimensional case. We see again, it's differentiable, nice patterns. And if I generated 10 random trials, I saw that my average color distance was 0.062. Average iteration time was pretty long, about 11 minutes, because it's such a complicated calculation. I can do this now with a three-dimensional case. This is geometry called a photonic glass. It's actually very interesting because it's semi-ordered rather than completely ordered. And so you can use statistical techniques to model, on average, where these spheres are going to be. This technique was developed by a lab at Harvard, and it's a combination of Mies scattering for each individual particle and a Fourier transform representing how they're related to each other in the matrix of the structure. And I get results. I see that the colors that I'm generating are fairly darker, and I think this is because the interfaces are more complicated and more likely to destructively interfere than they are to constructively interfere. But on average, my color distance is 0.08, so not bad, especially because I see that I'm lacking a lot of bright colors. And my iteration time was a little over a minute for each iteration. And finally, I can apply the package to doing something nature does very well, which is structural color in natural materials, such as a butterfly wing. So this is a swallowtail butterfly. And in nature, this blue part here is structurally colored. But we can try to structurally color the entire butterfly wing. So I begin with the image here. I use dominant colors to decompose it into 6 main colors, and then I'm going to perform the search algorithm on each of these 6 colors I see in the butterfly wing. And here are the results of this. I see that the blue matches very well, as I'd expect, because blue in nature is structurally colored. The yellow is an okay-ish match, but not bad. And then finally, the red is a very terrible match. And as disappointing as this may be, it's actually a physical result because there is no red structural color in nature. So I see that my results are consistent with what I'd expect. And so in conclusion, this method returns fairly good results for a range of different photonic geometries, and it's general enough to work for any mathematically characterized photonic system. So as long as you have a function that can take in photonic parameters and output a reflectance spectra, you can search for colors using the adaptive mesh search. And as computational models improve, as we are better at characterizing these systems, the results will improve with it. So this search method isn't going to become obsolete. It'll continue to be useful and relevant. With that, thank you, and I'd like to open the floor for questions. Yes?
You didn't talk about the last structure, the more regular shape structure.
Yeah.
Is that mathematically difficult to calculate the spectrum from?
The photonic glass? Oh, the Christmas tree one? That's like my favorite structural color. It's the Morpho butterfly wing. There are a few different models. One of them models it just as the one-dimensional. So it says, assume those layers, that's kind of the Christmas tree, are continuous. And you can get a pretty good model based on that. But mostly I just think it's cool. But yeah, there are models for that. I didn't try them though. Yeah?
If you go to the three-dimensional amorphous glass section, you sort of see that it kind of lacks the periodic rainbow that the 2.1 unit. Is that a consequence that the amorphous glass lacks long-range order, or if you increase the size of your lattice, we would see this colors?
I think it is a long-range order. Yeah, it's not quite as periodic. It's semi-periodic, and so you get kind of darker colors.
Even if you extended this search space sphere radius 500.
Yeah, because after, you can see on this edge here, it's already beginning to get gray, and on this edge, it's already black. So you're really kind of confined to that visible wavelengths range of 100 to 1,000 about. But yeah, I saw that this is really the only area I can find color. It does extend a little bit this way with the volume fraction, but that tapers off pretty fast too. Yeah. Yes?
I know you said that it's difficult
don't think so, but that would be really cool. It would be cool to like graph the sets of them and see if there's any transformation.
Because if you were to control the different displays,
Mhm.
if those structures will take you to the same place,
Yeah.
then, it might be a way of saying, okay, this over here is not the same metric.
Yeah.
So will give us the same place.
So then you'd only need one and you'd be able to find all the possibilities. That's super cool. I'd love to look at that. Yeah, thank you. Yes?
Commercially available materials that utilize this process?
Yeah. So this photonic glass, you kind of see that the colors aren't quite as nice, but this one's very easy to make because it actually self-assembles. And so you can buy spheres from like any chemical supplier and centrifuge them down, and you can have structurally colored materials just like that. And then right now there's photonic paints that are trying to use structural color. And then some people are interested in reflective displays, so kind of like your Kindle or your e-reader, something with that with structural color because it would have a much higher battery life. And the color would be just as vivid. Yeah. Yes?
My question is actually similar. Have you taken any of your calculated parameters and tried to create something precise?
I really want to. It's kind of expensive to do nanofabrication, so I haven't yet. But I want to just buy a bunch of these spheres off the internet and try it.
We have a device that's called a dip-pen nanoelectric machine.
Mhm.
And we've done diffraction gradients.
Mm.
Strips of polymer. And we've been working on new layers and stuff like that. So it's
Yeah.
interesting to see if we can take a couple of your numbers and create layers and get colors.
I really want to try that. Yeah. If you try it, let me know.
Yeah.
Yeah, the package is online, so you should be able to use it. Yeah. All right. Thank you very much.